Hi everybody, and welcome back to our series of preparation tutorials ahead of the external exam. And today the focus of our tutorial is the anatomy of a play. So I wanted to take the opportunity to look at how texts are actually put together so that ahead of actually learning to annotate your text, you're aware of what you should find in certain places and the ways in which that we refer to those elements when we're referring specifically to a play. Okay, so a play is really just an acted out narrative. So you should expect to see narrative elements, narrative stylistic devices in a play just as you would a story. So we should expect to see characters, setting, plot. There should be a complication. We should see the development of themes and we should see the presence of symbols. When we refer to characters, often in dramatic text, and certainly in Shakespeare, we need to be thinking about the idea of characterization. And that is a way of connecting what is in the text with the society or the cultural assumptions that existed outside the text at the time it was created. So rather than Macbeth, for example, being a character in his own mind, so a character who exists quite separate from the author as his creator, Macbeth becomes a characterization of certain qualities, a characterization even of a kind of person in society. Okay, so we should see those narrative elements. But because we're referring also to a text type that is unique in and of itself, there are certain elements that we should expect to see specifically in a play. Okay, so let's have a look at our terminology associated with the anatomy of a play. So as I mentioned, we should have our dramatic elements, our narrative elements, as we previously mentioned, and those are character, setting, plot, themes, symbols, and complications. We have our structural elements. I'm going to show you these with reference to my own copy of the play in a second. So we should have the title, the dramatis personae, words like act and scene, particular types of speeches within a play, so a monologue, a soliloquy, even a duologue. And then the elements or the signposts, the plot markers of a play, which include the orientation, the rising action, climax, falling action, and denouement or resolution. Just off the bottom of my page, but in a document that I will attached to this tutorial are textual features. And the two textual features that I really wanted to address and introduce to you today are the ideas of tragedy and hamartia. Okay, so let's have a look at some of those structural elements. First of all, let's look at the arrangement of a text in terms of its plot. So I mentioned that in a Shakespearean text, there are 5 key sections that you should expect to see: the exposition, the rising action, the climax, the falling action, and the denouement. And it's not by accident that a Shakespearean play is also arranged in 5 acts. So ahead of us beginning to annotate our text for aspects like theme or characterization, it's important that we consider annotating our text along the top of our page for navigation. And what that should ultimately help us identify is each of these 5 parts. So in Act 1, we see the orientation of our story. So that means that we should introduce all of the main characters. We should begin to establish some of the thematic problems that we will encounter and develop and ultimately resolve by the end of the play. We should see a complication, and that will ultimately lead then to the rising action. In Act 2, we explore rising action. Now, what rising action means is that we should see an increase in tension. Maybe a character who is ultimately villainous begins to demonstrate their violent nature. Maybe a character who is ultimately immoral or makes bad decisions will begin the process of making bad decisions. What is also important in a Shakespearean play, when the imagery of the monarch is used to show that the health of a kingdom reflects the health of the king, or in the case of human beings, the health of the mind reflects the health of the whole body, we should begin to see things starting to go wrong. So the weather is going to turn bad. We might have reference to an eclipse. We might have reference to animals behaving in an unusual way, and that's beginning to build that tension. Act 3 aligns with our climax. So the climax is ultimately the point of greatest emotional engagement. And what we should feel here is that whatever happens in this act is ultimately responsible for the character's fate. So what they do in this act is why they end up the way they end up, okay? Act 4 then is our falling action. We see the consequences of our actions, or the consequences of our protagonist's actions, in Act 4. And finally, in Act 5, a number of things might have to happen in order for normality or natural order to be restored. Now, I want you to think about that idea of natural order, because in a play where even the weather suggests that things are not as they should be, there will have to be deliberate steps taken to restore natural order in the kingdom. And for us as readers to be able to see that that natural order is ultimately what Shakespeare is holding up as an ideal. Okay, so this little worksheet that I'm referring to while I'm talking is also an attachment that you will find in the descriptor below, and you are welcome to print it out and add your own little dot points about the elements of orientation, rising action, climax, falling action, and denouement that you find specifically in Macbeth. All right, I'm also going to draw your attention to this fun little document, or this link, which I have also included in the descriptor below, which breaks down the parts of the text. Now, this document not only looks at the script itself, but it also provides you with a really handy understanding of a range of glossary terms associated with Shakespearean text specifically. So some of the words that we just don't use anymore, and therefore the meaning, their meaning, or the way they're used by a character in that particular scene isn't necessarily as clear to us. I strongly recommend that you take the time to read through that particular glossary list. That glossary list then will provide you with a really handy reference to begin annotating your text. So as you're finding examples of more nuanced terminology, these are the ones that exist below, like an aside, and the purpose of an aside, and how it might actually manifest on the stage. You can actually annotate your text for that and begin to build an understanding of what it is that other characters hear a character say, and the things that only the audience is aware of, producing that greater tension then and dramatic irony. Okay, so let's have a look using our annotated versions of Macbeth at some of those structural elements. So of course, we would expect to see the title of a play included in any narrative text. And certainly this one is no different. So here on the title page of our version of the play, we see the tragedy of Macbeth. And the use of that word tragedy is really specific, and I'm going to come to that in a moment because it's really central to understanding what it is that makes these kinds of texts separate from the histories, which often end in death also, and the comedies, which are not always entirely lighthearted. The second structural part of a play is the dramatis personae, which we would refer to more commonly as the characters in a play. Now, the character list that exists, or the dramatis personae that exists at the front of your printed version, is a great place for you to write a single dot point about the kind of character, the kind of person that character appears to be, either at the beginning of the play or at the end of the play, or what you see as their most defining characteristic. So if I was to make reference, for example, to Duncan, the King of Scotland, I might write next to him characteristic of chivalry, too trusting. Characteristic of chivalry, gullible on more than one occasion. All right, just a little dot point that helps me, first of all, sort who's who in the zoo, because sometimes characters have very similar last names, particularly when 3 of the characters in Macbeth actually start with Mac. That means that you have to be able to find something else to separate them. And you want to then think about how, though, the characteristics of each of those individual characters impact their relationship with each other, because that's fairly essential. And after that, we get to the script proper. And as I mentioned, we use the navigation tabs along the top like bookmarks. They help us jump from part to part of the script. And I've just annotated for the acts when it comes to my copy of Macbeth. If I was to look at my copy of King Lear, I've actually annotated for both acts and scenes, because the breakdown and change in what is happening in King Lear is far more pronounced in certain scenes and actually requires navigation to a very particular scene, not just the entirety of the climax or the entirety of the rising action. And so you can do either. Simply annotate the top of your book with just your act references and use them like bookmarks, or annotate for act and scene so that you can jump immediately to a scene that most explores a theme, most explores a symbol, most explores a character. Within each act, then, we break down the story into scenes. So when we make reference to something that happens, we say the act first, act 1, and then we make reference to the scene, scene 7, and then, if we want to go even further, the line 90. And by referring to the act, then the scene, and then the line, we actually allow our audience to know where this quote sits within the broader text. And that's really helpful for knowing how much has happened to that character at that point and what's still to come. Okay, but I mentioned that the title of the play is specifically The Tragedy of Macbeth. So there are 2 things that I would really like you to connect with. And one of these is actually shared on our course page. And I probably made reference to it in my introduction to all of the resources that we have produced for you. And it's this really excellent definition of a tragedy. Now, the highlighting is mine, and I think the highlighting is really valuable in understanding why it is that we study a story about a king when clearly we aren't kings and queens. And it's because this definition really highlights the ways in which tragedy, or the undoing of a character, is in their own control, or it happens so regularly that it really is honestly a human condition that could occur for any of us. So having a look at it, like the first bit makes reference to a couple of well-known plays, but let's look at the first of those pieces of highlighting. The heartbreaking conflict between what human beings need to be, deserve to be, and could be. So what they need to be, deserve to be, and could be, and what the time and place they live in condemns them to become. Okay? So when we think about cultural assumptions, values, attitudes, and beliefs, those societal values, attitudes, and beliefs can sit at odds with a character's own wants and needs. And trying to resolve the two is what can result in tragedy. So if we think about someone like Hamlet doesn't want to be the King of Denmark. He's not ready to be, and he's happy to be a student, maybe forever. The fact that the death of his father for a little bit of time leaves the throne vacant demands that he change what he had wanted for his life and step into that role. Okay, now that's still being played out in stories today, that idea of the unreadiness of the heir to take the throne, and ultimately what happens to them when they're forced into that role. The second point then is that Shakespeare makes it equally plain that there's nothing to stop human beings putting an end to such tragedies by changing the world that produced them and changing themselves in the process. Okay, so when we look at Macbeth, he doesn't necessarily take action to change the world that puts him into this place. So he fights the good fight. He's not necessarily a leader. He follows orders. He is bloody and violent, but he's good at what he does. He's not trying to affect change in society, but he can change himself. So we have in Act 1, Scene 7, a whole range of emotions where Macbeth is ultimately saying, I'm not going to do this. You know, my warrior's heart says, if I've got to do it, let's get it done quickly and move on. But my logical thinker's brain says, I shouldn't do this. He's my kinsman, he's my king, and I'm his host. And there are a whole lot of reasons why his death is not going to reflect well on me, not least of the fact that everyone loves Duncan. And even even in his death, people are still going to hold him as an example of a great king. So this is not going to bode well for anyone who comes afterward. But rather than change his nature, which wants the prize without the hard work, he ultimately takes the shortest route possible, killing the king, and yes, forces those prophecies to come true, but ultimately then also suffers the consequences of regicide and all of the crimes that follow. Okay, so then the next one says, although these particular characters end up defeated by the intolerable predicament in which they are trapped, the predicament itself is shown by them to be a product of a society whose authority can be resisted and contested. So the fact that he gets this advice from witches who, if we don't have any interest in the supernatural, are simply women who exist outside society, they've been marginalized, silenced, devalued. What they recognize, or what they demonstrate, is that there is a society with inequities, with imbalances that can be changed. And if we address the society, we can ultimately address the tragic nature of the character's outcome. Most of our characters don't do that, of course. They seem as though they're victims of society rather than active participants in it. And of course, for us as audience members, we're being encouraged to be active participants. And then finally, when we're looking at a character who is ultimately untethered by the end of the story, certainly that's true of King Lear being studied by our literature students, but so too is it true of someone like Lady Macbeth, that last highlighted point. Every one of them becomes a stranger in a world where they had once felt at home, and a stranger to a person that they used to be or thought they were. Okay, and that is absolutely characterized by Lady Macbeth and her out damn spot process, which highlights that she has become separated from the woman who believed she was entitled to be the queen because someone had said it was possible. And she is now simply this woman who, despite her bravado, was not able to cope with the consequences of her actions. Okay. So that's a great definition, and I strongly recommend you go back and have a little bit of a read of that, as well as the two documents that are attached in the descriptor below. But if we needed a really simple working definition of a tragedy, what I would say is that a tragedy is a story about a character who is undone by their own hamasha. So our key word of vocabulary and our key concept when we talk about the characterization of a hero or a villain is the idea of hamasha, and that's spelled Hamartia. So a character's hamasha is their fatal flaw. And as is the case with us as human beings, most of Shakespeare's characters have traits that could be either a great strength or a fatal flaw. What's more, most of those fatal flaws could be perfectly fine if they were slightly changed. So Macbeth's great failing is not necessarily ambition. Ambition, as we know, is probably fairly necessary. We're talking about a soldier who wants to survive battles, who maybe seeks promotion, or at least seeks greater control over the battlefield because that's his area of expertise. And so a certain amount of ambition is absolutely essential. The issue is not ambition in and of itself, it is that unchecked nature of ambition, or ambition without hard work. And certainly we see combinations of fatal flaws like that all around us. The example I used to my literature class the other day was I could have two fatal flaws. I might say, I am too trusting of people. I'm a bad judge of character. That could be my first flaw. And I could say, I am really smart and I'm arrogant about my intelligence. So let's put those together. I'm arrogant about my intelligence. I'm arrogant. I think I'm better than other people, but I'm also too trusting of people. I said I might meet a sticky end like Julius Caesar did. So somebody who believed he had great capability and who trusted the people who he associated with to also believe he had great capability. Let's put those two traits in other people's hands, though. King Duncan is far too trusting of people. Not only has he already been betrayed by the previous Thane of Cawdor, he has just awarded Macbeth because of his violence. Like, that's literally the whole reason he was given that title. But rather than perhaps recognize that he is an inherently violent person, Duncan chooses to ignore that. So he is indeed too trusting, but not necessarily arrogant about intelligence. He simply believes as a good and benevolent king, good things will happen to him. And the tragic nature of the story, of course, is that not everybody around him is imbued with the same principles of chivalry that he is. Okay, so the takeaways from this particular tutorial. You need to think about the structure of your text. This is a stylistic device. What happens in Act 1 happens in Act 1 for a reason. The arrangement of the text as far as orientation, rising action, climax, falling action, and denouement occur in that order for your education. Those elements are yours to discuss, and what happens to characters in each of those is relevant to you in understanding the meaning that Shakespeare is trying to make. In addition to the structural elements of a text, you can think about the normal elements of a narrative. So the way in which the characterization of values, attitudes, and beliefs is created. And finally, there are textual features. This is a tragedy because a title character has been undone by his own fatal flaw, not by the actions of somebody else. Okay, so thinking about what agency we have over ourselves and what consequences that causes when I choose to give in to my fatal flaw. Okay, so as is always, if you have any questions, please add them below or chuck me an email, and I'm more than happy to prepare a little tutorial to particularly address something you need. Okay, bye.